I want to discuss the moral wrong of launching a war of conquest, like Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine, using the moral theory that I've been presenting here. Spoiler alert, Putin is one of the most morally disgusting people to have cursed the surface of the earth since Hitler. One of, because he shares that position with others who have launched wars of conquest since Hitler, such as Saddam Hussein of Iraq and Kim Il-sung of North Korea. Launching a war of conquest is the worst moral crime. It's the one that warrants the greatest condemnation and contempt for its perpetrators. Compare a person who would do such a thing with a random shooter who walks out into a workplace or a school or just goes out onto the street and starts firing. It would take 1 million of these people to approximate one Vladimir Putin. Truth be told, genocide sits at the top of the list as well, but let's not get distracted. The question is, can I prove this? When I say that wars of conquest are the greatest evil, or Putin is the most immoral person, am I saying something other than uttering a particularly emphatic preference, along the same lines of, I find it disgusting to put ketchup on ice cream? I'm going to start with a general account of wrongness. I'm then going to argue that ordering a war of territorial conquest is morally wrong. Putin ordered a war of territorial conquest, as did Saddam Hussein, Kim Il-sung, and others, and so what they did was morally wrong. Putin's wrongdoing has so far resulted in 1.4 million casualties, a number that far exceeds the casualty list of all mass shooters combined. So first, a definition of wrong. To say that an act is wrong is to say that people generally have reasons to use condemnation to promote a universal aversion to performing acts of that type. We can easily see how this applies to mass shootings. People generally have reasons to produce within the community a strong aversion to performing acts of this type. These reasons are found in their reasons to avoid being maimed or killed, and to save those that they care about from being maimed or killed. And there's a few people who don't want anybody to be maimed or killed. To the degree that we can succeed in promoting such an aversion, to that degree we protect ourselves and those we care about from being victims of acts of this type. And I want to point out how this definition not only works for mass shootings, it also works for breaking promises, drunk driving, theft, vandalism, rape, arson, a number of types of actions also considered wrong. All of these actions are of a type that people generally have reasons to make each other reluctant to perform. And the reasons that I'm talking about are basic desire-dependent reasons. Our aversion to our own pain and the pain of those we care about. Hunger, thirst, the desire satisfaction power of good health, security and sanitation, these types of things. Given this account of what it takes for a type of action to be morally wrong, ordering an invasion of another country to take part or all of its territory is morally wrong. That is to say, people do genuinely have reasons to promote universally an aversion, a sense of moral outrage and disgust towards anybody who would order an invasion to conquer all or part of another country. Perhaps the reasons people have to promote such an aversion are obvious. We can begin with the 1.4 million people maimed and killed so far in Putin's war. These people have reasons to regard Putin with moral contempt. If not for him, they would likely be alive and whole today. And these 1.4 million people had others who cared about them. Others who had reasons to see that their friends and family members remain alive and whole. They too can blame Putin for the fact that their friends and family members did not, in fact, remain alive and whole. This 1.4 million people includes Ukrainians and Russians and others harmed in Putin's war. The Russian casualties are still people that Putin decided to sacrifice for his own glory. Those maimed and killed are not the only ones with reasons to condemn Putin for his actions. There's the soldier in the battlefield, living in fear of his or her life, suffering what we might call the inconveniences of war. The way Putin fights this war, the whole civilian population of Ukraine fits this description, since Putin doesn't seem to care who he kills. I have so far talked only about the loss of life or limb, or the fear of such a loss. The destruction of roads, rails, bridges, power plants, hospitals, schools, homes, farms, and other property also provides those who own or benefit from those goods to condemn Putin for his wrongdoing. If not for Putin, they too would have likely remained whole and functioning as they should. In Ukraine, children, even if they escape being maimed or killed, are suffering a disruption in their education and also being made to suffer the psychological trauma that can be expected to haunt their whole adult lives. These people and those who care about them have further reasons to hold Putin in moral contempt for his actions. And we must consider opportunity costs. The term opportunity costs is an economic term that refers to the other things that people could have done with the same resources. For example, imagine what Russia would be like today if Putin had devoted the people and the money to something other than war, such as, for example, paying to improve the infrastructure of Russia, provide for the health and education of its people, or spend it on useful scientific research. What would Ukraine be like today if it had been given the freedom to work on these things? And while we're at it, we must include what other countries are spending to counter Putin's moral crime, contributing to the defense of Putin's victims. These countries could have also used that money on education, health, and research to promote the public good. Remember, what we are counting here are the people who have reasons to hold Putin, or anybody who launches a war of conquest, in moral contempt. So we must include the people who would have obtained a benefit if the money spent in countering Putin's evil had been available to spend on public goods instead, or if the people had just been allowed to keep the money to spend as they please. And perhaps the most important reason to hold Putin in moral contempt. Putin, in asserting that wars of conquest are legitimate and might be profitable, makes future wars of conquest, with all of their costs, much more likely. It would be far better for everybody to live in a world where wars of conquest are regarded with such moral contempt that it can save us and future generations from suffering their costs. Here, I must mention Donald Trump with his refusal to rule out a war of conquest to take over Greenland or the Panama Canal. Putin has undermined the moral rules that make wars of conquest less likely, and as a result, Trump refuses to support the moral prohibition on wars of conquest and expresses a willingness himself to launch such a war. The moral prohibition on wars of conquest, like all moral principles, cannot be evaluated by looking at a single case. We can use a case study to illustrate the concepts involved, but it is an incomplete argument. We need to look at wars of conquest more generally to determine if sufficient reason exists for a principle that morally condemns wars of conquest generally. This is an extremely easy case to make. Consider the other examples: Kim Il-jong's invasion of South Korea, Saddam Hussein's invasions of Iraq and Kuwait. The soldiers, the civilians, the people around the world who would have obtained a benefit by putting the same people and resources to work on producing public goods, all point to reasons to condemn these invasions, as well as the contributions these leaders made to making other invasions more likely by their declaration that a war of conquest is legitimate. We have the examples of Hitler's wars of conquest and those of Imperial Japan. We can go even further back in history and consider Napoleon's campaigns of conquest. With all of the death and maiming, disease and destruction, it's clearly the case that people living at the time had a lot of reasons to condemn wars of conquest. Here, too, imagine if the people and the resources had been put to work instead improving the roads and canals of Europe, providing for better education of the population, putting serious research into the new techniques in farming, medicine, and the like that were just emerging as a result of the Age of Enlightenment. I'll simply challenge you to name a war of conquest where people generally, not a small handful of its leaders, but the general population obtained so much benefit from the war as to make the cost worthwhile. And not only the cost of that war, but the cost of all of the wars of conquest that a widespread condemnation of all such wars would have prevented. And remember, the people generally means everybody, not just the invading army. A war of conquest, like a theft or murder, or a rape that the perpetrator enjoyed and brought the perpetrator no bad consequences might profit the perpetrator, but that does not make the act moral. History makes plain that people generally, people like you and me, have reasons to hold in moral contempt anybody who would launch a war of conquest. We have reasons to think of those who would order such a war of conquest as we would think of a random mass shooter times a million or more. They are the worst that humanity has to offer. Now I want to make more precise the principle that I am talking about by discussing some of its implications. In looking at these implications, we can deal with some of the possible objections to this principle. First, this is not pacifism. This is not a claim that nobody should engage in or support violence of any kind. Yes, the world would be a better place if everybody were to give up violence, but that's never going to happen. So that is not a proposal worth taking seriously. The claim that we should be pacifists is much like the claim that we should abolish the police, courts, and prisons and allow any and all thieves, rapists, and murderers to act as they please with impunity, making no effort to stop them. This is why the individual who launches the war of conquest is morally charged with imposing on others the cost of opposing them. It's not the taxpayers' fault that we need police, courts, and prisons. It's the fault of those who commit crimes that make these necessary. It is the perpetrators of wars of conquest that make military defense necessary. Some may object that the view being put forward here is idealistic, that we can't hope to stop all wars of conquest. Now, it's true, we cannot stop all wars of conquest. However, that is not the measure of success. If we prevent even one, we have been successful. Our moral condemnation of theft, rape, and murder has not brought an end to theft, rape, and murder. However, this does not imply that we should stop thinking of theft, rape, and murder as wrong. As the two previous topics have suggested, the moral condemnation of wars of conquest justifies a moral response, in the same way that theft, rape, and murder justify a moral response. A community that ignores its thieves, rapists, and murderers, allowing them to go unchallenged, creates a community of suffering. A world that ignores wars of conquest creates a world of suffering. The First Persian Gulf War provides an illustrative example of how the world should respond to all wars of conquest. When Iraq invaded Kuwait, the world responded with condemnation and an active response to reverse the invasion. It may be the case that not every individual had a noble motive in doing so, but that is not relevant to the rightness of doing so. Clearly, doing the right thing for the right reasons is the best option, but doing the right thing for the wrong reasons is still better than doing the wrong thing. We may lack admiration for the individual who prevents a kidnapping because they want a reward, but we don't say that, since they were acting on a bad motive, that they did something wrong when they prevented the kidnapping. It's also the case that if, for example, raping another person is wrong, then helping the rapist is also wrong. And if wars of conquest are wrong, then aiding those who order a war of conquest is also wrong. Vladimir Putin, Kim Il-jong, Saddam Hussein, Hitler, Napoleon, Pope Urban II, the one who ordered the First Crusade, Genghis Khan, Charlemagne, Julius Caesar, Alexander, these people would have been harmless without an army of people willing to carry out their orders. Now, I do plan on creating an entire video dedicated to the subject of the obligation to enforce or refuse to enforce the law. But in that video, this principle will play a central role. Those who assist in the crime of war of conquest are not innocent. They're not heroes. They are what makes the crimes possible. The fewer of them that we have in the world, the better off the world will be. This then is an illustration of how somebody using the theory of morality that I'm putting forth in these videos would use it to determine and support a moral conclusion. Note that none of what I had written depends on my beliefs or desires. I've argued that people generally have reasons to condemn those who launch wars of conquest. This was true before I was born. It will be true after I die. And the attitudes that I adopt between those two events has no relevance to the fact that people generally have reasons to condemn those who engage in wars of conquest. The same is true of breaking promises, drunk driving, vandalism, theft, assault, rape, murder, and the like. People generally had reasons to condemn those who did such things before I was born. They will continue to have reasons to condemn people who do such things after I die. And the attitudes that I adopt between these two events will have no impact on this fact. At the level of applied ethics, this video states that Putin is an evil human being and should be given the moral contempt and condemnation that he deserves. At the level of moral theory, this video states that wars of conquest are wrong and that anybody who launches or leads a war of conquest is deserving of moral contempt. At the level of metaethics, to say that an act is wrong is to say that people generally have reasons to use condemnation to promote a universal aversion to performing acts of that type. As it turns out, one could reject this whole moral theory and it would still be true that people generally, you, me, nearly everybody, has reasons to condemn and to encourage each other to condemn wars of conquest. It would be wise to do so. Doing so may help to prevent the next war of conquest, just like an attitude of condemnation towards rape and murder might help make rape and murder less common, at least less common than they would be if we were passively indifferent towards rape and murder. Here's an action item. Take a few moments to remind people that we have reasons to condemn wars of conquest and those who start them, and to treat those people as we would treat mass murderers, because that is what they are. In the meantime, I am presenting a moral theory that allows us to make sense of these judgments, and I hope to apply this theory to other moral issues in the future. I hope that you'll join me.